Welcome everyone. Today we're going to discuss about some of the important factor, and this factor is about initiative and especially on policy applications. What is policy or policy application? When does it make sense to use fiscal policy or monetary policy? How are Keynesian and neoclassical perspective applied in the real world? Under what circumstances do fiscal or monetary policy work well or not so well in managing the economy? For the activist Keynesians, what are the limits to fiscal and monetary policy that you would endorse and why? For the laissez failures, neoclassics, what is the minimal fiscal and monetary policy that makes sense and why? How is macroeconomics policy is the real world more complicated than in theory? Viewpoint on government policy. Neoclassic perspective. Neoclassic economic favor law tax in its simulate package aggregate supply and economic growth. Favor limited government spending, passive monetary policy. Keynesian perspective. The economy can being in equilibrium at a level of GDP that does not correspondent to potential. Government has a responsibility to manage the economy, encourage simulating the economy during recessionary times and slowing the economy down during booms. Liquidity trap. Keynesian idea that when interest rates are very low, people are willing to hold cash rather than put it into the financial market, eliminating the ability for expansionary monetary policy to work. Philip Carr's contractionary fiscal policy, tax increase or cut in government spending designed to decrease aggregate demand and reduce inflationary pressures. Expansionary fiscal policy, tax cut or increase in government spending designed to simulate aggregate demand and move the economy out of recessions. Philip Carr, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Stacked stagflations, a simultaneous increase in between unemployment and inflation. In 1950s, A.W. Philip, an economist and the London School of Economics, was studying 16 years of data for the British economy and the discovered and the apparel investment relationship between unemployment and wage inflation. The original Keynesian view using the ADAS model was that AS was L-shaped. Most Keynesian economists today have a more nuanced views of the AS curve. Neuroclassical Philip curve. There is always a temporary trade-off between inflation, unemployment, and raise is no permanent trade-off. Neutral rate hypothesis. Neoclassical view that since the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, the long-run Phillips curve is also vertical. There is no trade-off in the long run between inflation and unemployment. Keynesian Philip curve. Changer is inflationary or expectation and supply shocks cause the Phillips curves to be verticals when no longer run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Neoclassic economics asks why people do not learn that they consistently underestimate inflation. Should not they learn from their mistakes? If individuals are rationals, should not they use all available information to improve their predictions of inflation, not just past value of it? Adaptive expectations. The idea that people extrapolate from past value of some economic variables to predict future value of that variables. Demand management policy, using monetary and fiscal policy to influence aggregate demand and thus real GDP and unemployment. The rational expectations predictions equals to the predictions of the underlying economic model. The natural rate hypothesis argues that while there may be a trade-off between inflation and unemployment in the short run, there is no trade-off in the long run. Rational expectation says that the economic agent should use all the information they have about how the economic operates to make predictions about economic variables in the future. These ideas were formalized by the John Moot, who said expectations are rational if the prediction equals to the predictions of the underlying economic model. If economic agents have rational expectation, demand management policy can never be effective. Early neoclassical criticized Keynesian views about fiscal policy for ignoring the crowding out effect. Crowding out. Expansion fiscal policy cause interest rate to rise, which reduce business investment limit the effect of the fiscal expansion. How much does it cost? Neoclassical argue for complete crowding out, meaning that fiscal policy was completely ineffective since an increase in government spending would be completely offset by a decrease in privilege investment spending with no uh, net effect on aggregate demand. Keynesians argue for incomplete crowding out, thus fiscal policy would be weaker than originally thought, but still effective to a certain degree. Radian equivalence, the theory that relatively private households might increase their saving in anticipations of the future tax liability from government borrowing and vice versa. Twin deflect that occurs when a country is running both a trade and a budget deflect. Recognitions or data along the limit the time is taken determine that a recession has occurred. Legislations or decretion lags, the time it takes to pass a bill, implementation or transmission lag, the time it takes to short the projections or executions of monetary policy, impact or effectiveness lags, the time it takes for the new policy to the payout. Policy implications, dim patience business cycle versus laissez failures. Three goals of for macroeconomics: full employment, stable price, and economic growth. Economics tend to grow over time as a result of increase in the quantity and quality of labor and capital and improvement of in technology. Neoclassical economics are predisposed towards market outcome and or suspicious of using aggregate demand to manage the economy. Keynesian economists are suspicious of making outcome and learn toward demand managing policy. What economic viewpoint focus on aggregate demand to reduce unemployment and to stimulate the economics during a recession? What economics view believe in aggregate demand rise rapidly, it leads to inflation pressure. Policy implications. Unemployment can be divided into two categories: cycle unemployment, natural rate of unemployment. Keynesian economists worry about the loss of jobs, and neoclassical think that give the real world implications of fiscal monetary policy discussed above. It is difficult to get them right. Better to simply the economy adjust back to the potential output on its own. There are many implications we have, and we have to discuss on the policy making and policy related activities. And if we can understand these policy related activities in an effective way, that time we can take necessary initiative. Changing a aggregated demand always result in unemployment going on one way while inflation goes the other. Changing in aggregated supply push inflation and unemployment in the same directions at the same time. If the shock is positive, shifting as to the right, this is very good since both inflation and unemployment fall. If the shock is negative, shifting AS to the left, the output is not good sign both inflation and unemployment. Unemployment can be divided into two categories: cycle employments and natural rate of unemployment. Keynesian economists worry about the loss of jobs and income that may persist over time. Neoclassical think that give the real world complications of fiscal and monetary policy discuss about it is difficult to get them right, but better to simply let the economy adjust back to potential output on its own. Changes in aggregate demand always result in unemployment going one way while inflation goes the other. Changing in aggregate supply pulls inflation and unemployment in the same direction at the same time. If the shock is positive, shifting as to the right. This is why very poor signs both inflation and unemployment fall. If the shock is negative, shifting as to the left, the output is not good since the both inflation and unemployment rise. Kianci believe that cost of allowing the economy to recovery from recessionary and inflationary gap that too high. Believe in promoting economic growth. Favor government investing is infrastructure, government spending, cascade research and developments, human capital, education. Neoclassical do not believe in fine tuning the economy. Prefer to focus policy of economic growth. Economic growth is forecast by a stable economic environment with a low rate of inflation. If we go for the quick review, we can find summarize the neoclassical views on the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy. Summarize the Keynesian view of effectiveness of the fiscal and monetary policy. What is the Philip curve and its implication of theory of Keynesian economics? How does Philip curve drive from the aggregate supply curve? What is the difference between Keynesian and neoclassical view of Philip curve? How does the theory of rational expectations mean that demand management policy is ineffective? What is the Ricardian's equivalence? How does government borrows effective private spending? What is the difference between type of policy lag? How does policy lag, policy impressions, time and policy complications compare and constant Keynesian and neoclassical policy? What is there is no good policy response to a negative aggregate supply shock? What is the difference between monetary policy or neoclassical economists would recommend to promote economic growth, and this a keynote economists would be recommended? So these are the highly effective and efficient points. And with this way, we can understand the economic policy, economic aggregate, economic demand, and most important thing is that we can focus on many effectiveness on the policy. And by this way, we can grow together and we can implement proper policy for our economy. And this is the ultimately objective of School of Talent Economy. We want to grow together and we want to create a combined economical factors. Thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. If you have any specific question, please ask me this question. Thank you.